Tonight's lecture is a particular treat for me since I have in my household a passionate amateur Egyptologist, and I suspect that many of you here tonight are also passionate Egyptologists, either amateur or professional. Few people realize that the first home of the Museum of Fine Arts was the Boston Athenaeum, and that the Athenaeum's galleries here once housed several thousand Egyptian objects. Today, the Department of Egyptian Art at the MFA Boston has grown to include some 70,000 objects and is one of the finest collections of its kind in the world. Recently celebrating its 100th year anniversary, it is also the oldest such department in the United States. Our lecturer tonight, Dr. Rita E. Freed, has been working at the MFA Boston's Ancient Egyptian Department for 15 years. She was recently named to the John F. Cogan Jr. and Mary L. Cornille Chair of the Department of Art of the Ancient World. She is also adjunct professor of art at Wellesley College. Dr. Freed has curated a number of internationally acclaimed exhibitions on the subject of ancient Egyptian and Nubian art, including Rameses the Great, which toured the country in the late 1980s, and Pharaohs of the Sun, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamen in 1999, which traveled to Chicago, Los Angeles, and Leiden, the Netherlands. Dr. Freed has participated in archaeological excavations in Egypt, Cyprus, and Israel. Tonight, Dr. Freed will examine how Boston became interested in ancient Egypt, when the first objects arrived on Boston shores, and how the collection developed to its present size and quality. Tonight's lecture is being taped. We are taping it also for the WGBH Forum Network, when it will be rebroadcast at a later date. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Freed.
Thanks, Hugh. You've got to tell me if you can't hear me or if this is too loud. I have to tell you, this is the first time I've been to the Athenaeum. I'm not sure why it's the first time, but I feel right at home. And I think it's a combination of things. It's the wonderful atmosphere here, the scholarly sense of history and memories. And of course, as Hugh alluded to, it's the fact that it was the first home of the MFA. And Monica just took me to the third floor where those first 5,000 Egyptian objects were once exhibited. And so I think it's absolutely fitting for me to be here talking to you about the beginnings of the Egyptian collection at the MFA and where we were and where we've come from there. Just to go back, and let me just say that's only one of the ways that the MFA and the Athenaeum are related. And that interrelation does go back to the very beginning, because I'd like to think it was in a room like this that a few men sat together, talked about their collections, and thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice if this little town we're in had its own museum? And it was right here that they put their heads together and established the first Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And of course, when they established it, it had no home other than here. Frankly, it didn't really have a collection either, except the paintings that they donated. And those paintings hung on the walls, particularly on the third floor, but I think all around here. And that's the way things were for a little while. And it was perfectly adequate. It was adequate for 2 years, to be exact, because in 1872, 2 years after the museum was founded, 2 years later, in 1872, came the first large collection to the museum. Before that time, they thought it would grow primarily from the purchase of plaster casts or donations of paintings here and there. They thought plaster casts because they thought all of the important objects were already in European museums or private houses, and they simply weren't available. So I have to assume that the trustees of the museum were quite surprised when they were given their first collection, their first 5,000 objects. And those objects, of course, were Egyptian objects. So, that, needless to say, that changed everything. Those first 5,000 were the beginning of what was to become, as you said, one of the finest Egyptian collections in the world. We've grown from about 5,000 to about 70,000 and counting. We do count down, too. We do deaccession. But we actually first now, thanks to technology, really have a sense of how many objects we have. So what I want to do this evening is to talk, or brag a little bit about how, not only where we started, but how we got to where we are today, and how we came to have that collection apart from the first 5,000, that is. So I'm going to start immediately, and I think my biggest challenge may be to navigate the projector. There we are. Okay. Now, we came to have this fabulous collection, in short, because we excavated it. Bear with me for a second. And that is apart from our first 5,000. And our most famous objects come from right here. And they come from about 40 years of excavation, not only here at Giza, the pyramid site, but also at 23 different sites, or additional sites in Egypt and the Sudan. And they came at a time when if you excavated something, you were given half of what you found by the government in charge. A very generous policy of division of objects. And that policy continued up until the early 1980s, actually. You may not have gotten half, but you got something. And the excavations on our behalf, on the museum's behalf, were conducted by a man by the name of George Reisner. And it was brought home to me. I should also say 2002 marked the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Egyptian Department. 2005, that is this year, marks 100 years since we started the excavations. And you'll hear more about that later. But and those excavations genuinely would not have happened, or certainly would not have been as successful, without the brilliant direction of a man by the name of George Andrew Reisner. Now, Reisner's importance and just what a larger-than-life figure he was brought home to me shortly after I became curator in 1989. And that's when George Reisner received a letter. Now, George Reisner has been dead since 1942. And this letter came more than a half a century after his death. And needless to say, I was intrigued. I was intrigued at how somebody's reputation could be that, could last for so long, obviously through the eyes of a child. But I'll get back to that in a minute. First, I mentioned that you saw the slide of the pyramids. Let me just locate the pyramids for you. They're right at the juncture of the Delta and the Nile Valley here. And that is where the expedition, what became the Harvard-Boston expedition, had its home. And that was Reisner's base and where he spent his summers. We have the collection we do. We were definitely in competition with the Met. But we have the collection we do because the Met went home in the summertime. Reisner went to Giza in the summertime. That's another story. And among his... so here we are, of course, at Giza. As I said, it was one of 23 sites he excavated. He would spend winters in the Sudan where it truly was impossible to be in the summertime. So it's thanks to all of those years of work, those nearly 40 years of excavation, that we have the collection we do today. And I know I'm talking to the converted anyway, and I know you know that this is our big Old Kingdom gallery, our big gallery of art of the Pyramid Age, dating from about 2500 BC. And I will say, without exaggeration, that this is the finest collection of art of the Pyramid Age outside of Cairo, without hesitation, without exaggeration. And we have a number of things that Cairo doesn't have. That's also another story. So, again, we began excavating in 1905, And we last worked at the pyramids. Well, this is from the early excavations. I have to say, some of you were just in Egypt with me a couple of weeks ago, and if you remember, I pointed out this little railroad car that they still use to haul dirt away. Well, here it is in the early excavations, and our last excavation in Giza was just a few years ago. And strictly speaking, we're not excavating today. What we're trying to do is preserve and publish what Reisner did. And I'll get into that in a little while. But I thought what I'd really concentrate on today was sort of giving you the inside story of how we got involved in Giza and why. And that really goes back to Boston's early love affair with Egypt. Boston, of course, the Athens of America, the home of the Pilgrim Fathers, the Bible was very important. It was taught in every classroom, and you can't teach the Bible without teaching Egypt. So there was definitely a connection. It was the Boston area, Salem to be exact, where the first mummies arrived on U.S. shores, and that was the very early 19th century. The first lecture series on ancient Egypt took place in Boston, and it was sold out. Apparently, over 5,000 people in 1835 listened to lectures on Egypt. 1832, Mount Auburn Cemetery, the first Egyptian revival cemetery. And right across the street, around the corner here, you also in the, it's not the North Church, it's the Granary Burying Ground, also an Egyptian gate. So it's all around you. So it really made sense. In that sense, it really was legitimate that when the museum was first founded, shortly thereafter, that they would be interested in Egyptian material. And that Egyptian collection was, as I said, first exhibited right here on the third floor, and but it wasn't exhibited here long. This is some of our more recent work where we're collating drawings and what is on the wall. Here we are. This is not here, but the museum in Copley Square, which opened in 1876. That early collection, of course, consisted of what every child wants to see, a lot of mummies, funerary objects, that sort of thing. And this material was collected by a man, it was collected by a man by the name of Robert Hay, a man from Scotland who had been in Egypt in 1828 and had formed the collection. He sold it at the London Crystal Palace in the 1860s, and it was purchased by a man by the name of Samuel Ald's Way, who was described by one of his descendants as a scallywag and a crook, and that's not from me. Died a year later, and the collection passed on to his son. His son was an artist, C. Granville Way, and it was the son who just said, what am I going to do with this, and donated it to the 2-year-old museum. So the museum, I have to assume that some of these objects were on view just 2 stories above me. But here they are in the Copley Square Museum, the site of the Copley Plaza Hotel. Well, these are small objects, largely. However, Egypt, of course, is monumental. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait long before the first monumental objects came, just a few years later, 1875. And they were collected by somebody who's also connected with the Athenaeum, namely, although you'd never recognize him here, I suspect, John Lowell. Lowell, we think, was John Lowell was the first Bostonian to travel to Egypt, and he was there in 1835. He went up the Nile. He was escaping from a great personal tragedy. His wife and 2 daughters had just passed away from diphtheria, and he was going to get as far away as he could. He went to Europe, picked up an artist, as people often did, and then went to Egypt to trace the steps of the Bible. And was planning to just spend a few days in Egypt and before he went on to Israel, but things didn't work out that way, and he went on to Thebes. He went from the area of Cairo down south because he heard rumors of plague in Cairo, and then just continued on. Lowell collected whatever he saw, and I'd like to say whatever he could carry, but incidentally, it was fashionable at the time to dress in native costume, and he has certainly done that. As I said, he collected whatever he could carry, including part of the cult shrine at Karnak of Philip Aridaeus and this 1,000-pound statue of the lioness goddess Sekhmet, which is now a prized possession. So he sent these back, fortunately. Lowell went on to cross Sinai and the Red Sea and unfortunately died en route to India. However, the drawings made by his artist and his objects survived, and as did his very important diaries. Now, the originals of those diaries are right here in the Athenaeum, and are one of the manuscripts that I think are really worthy of seeing the light of day and being published, and I hope that will happen sooner rather than later. And it's not for the Athenaeum to do. It's really more for the Egyptian department to do. But again, it's nice to be here where they are. It feels good. Not one, but actually two Sekhmet statues, 5,000 objects. This was 1875. They moved as quickly as they could to the museum in Copley Square, and the collection continued growing. In 1880, there was a group founded in London called the Egypt Exploration Society. It was founded so that there would be a scientific basis for excavating in Egypt. And also with this, if you excavated, you got half of what you found. You could become a member of the Egypt Exploration Society, and soon there were so many American members that they decided to found an American branch. That American branch was right here, right in Boston. And that's why we have the mother lode of objects from the Egypt Exploration Society. Well, that was in the 1880s. We still didn't have an Egyptian department at the museum. And one of the reasons we didn't have an Egyptian department was because of a man named Charles Greeley Loring. Loring was actually the first full-time director of the museum. But he didn't start that way. This was a man who was known as General Loring because his real fame came from being a Civil War general. And the museum trustees, as they were surveying these 5,000-plus objects, realized they needed somebody who could figure out what to do with them. So they found General Loring and asked him to act as registrar and register them in, describe them, and put them on view. And he then went on to become the first full-time director of the museum. And every registrar, every librarian, every curator is a collector. And he wasn't going to let these 5,000 objects out of his hands. So he was director for about 22 years. When he died in 1902, he died actually in August of 1902. September of 1902 is when the trustees got together and established the Egyptian department. And they did so because, I can just picture this. There they were with this major Egyptian collection, at that point the largest Egyptian collection in the country, and nobody who knew anything about it. So they voted to establish a department and hired a full-time Egyptologist. And that Egyptologist, whose name was Albert Lithgow, was charged with augmenting the collection and filling in the gaps. There we go. And it was also under Lithgow that the Copley Square Museum moved to its present quarters as you see it today. This building opened in 1902. By that time, The largest collection of the museum was the Egyptian collection. And it had totally outgrown the space. The plaster casts that the trustees had first bought were now pushed into corners and much later just dispensed with. Lithgow, the first curator of Egyptian art at the museum, was really quite a visionary, and he realized that he could go to Europe or go to Egypt and buy objects, but better was to excavate them, because not only could a small amount of money go much farther in those days, I'm sure a day's wages were a few pennies, but also you had a cultural context for the material that you found, and the material became much more than just pretty objects. And although Lithgow himself was not an archaeologist, he was able to hire this man, George Reisner, who was actually his professor, to excavate on his behalf. Now, Reisner actually was already in Egypt excavating on behalf of Phoebe Hearst of newspaper fame, but some of her gold mines in California weren't working out, and she was forced to retrench. And so Reisner became available. Now, before Reisner's day, anybody really could excavate in Egypt. You just showed up with a staff and some money and started working. Things were really getting out of hand. The population was expanding, there was widespread looting going on, and finally the Antiquities Organization in Egypt insisted that only people from reputable institutions could, in fact, excavate. And that, of course, explains why Giza, which was potentially the site of the pyramids, potentially the richest site in Egypt, was being excavated by a member of the British Parliament when Reisner got there. Well, Reisner put a stop to this looting operation, and when this law came through that only reputable institutions could excavate, 3 people stepped forward to excavate at Giza. There was Reisner, who you see on the right, for Boston, George Steindorf on behalf of Leipzig in Germany, and there was also a man on behalf of Turin, Italy, all wanting to excavate the pyramids. Well, that was no problem. 3 men, 3 countries, 3 pyramids. And so the Antiquities Organization decided to consider their application together, and the site was granted, with the idea that the site would be divided by mutual agreement. Now, as you look at these, it quickly becomes apparent that all things are not equal. And that was intriguing to Reisner. What he did, unbeknownst to the others, was to send one of his workmen around to kind of snoop. And it quickly became apparent that the third pyramid, while it looked to be the smallest pyramid, while it looked to be the least promising, was in fact the most promising because it was the least plundered. And Reisner realized that. So what happened was that the 3 men got together on the porch of the Mina House Hotel, and if any of you have been to Egypt, and to the pyramids, you have undoubtedly seen Mina House, which is still there, although in its much renovated form. What they did, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. What they did was to draw strips of paper, put them in Mrs. Reisner's hat, and pluck them out of the hat. They were able that way to divide not only the pyramids but the cemeteries, the private cemeteries that were outside it. Reisner, as I said, appearances were deceiving, and Reisner quickly realized that the third pyramid was the one he wanted. This is one of the MFA's treasures, and this comes from outside the third pyramid. So, of course, he would not have realized that. But this is how things went. As I mentioned, the vast cemeteries outside the pyramids, private cemeteries, were divided by the strips in Mrs. Reisner's hat. Then, in Reisner's words, then we proceeded to divide the pyramids. I perceived that the Italians were interested in the first pyramid and the Germans in the second. I kept my mouth shut and let them wrangle. When they had adjusted the line between the first and second pyramid, the Italians, thinking that I might insist on a ballot, resigned to me the northern part of the area east of the first pyramid if I would accept the third pyramid. I was perfectly willing to have the third pyramid, but of course I accepted his offer. And then what happened was that in addition to they awarded him another whole cemetery in addition to the third pyramid for his graciousness in accepting the third pyramid. So everything you see in red was and more on the other side was excavated by Boston. The Italians got fed up after the first little bit, and Reisner was able to take over their section. The middle half was divided. The middle half was excavated by the Germans, and that explains why, in many instances, we have half a relief. The other half is in either Leipzig or elsewhere in Germany. So, how did we pay for these excavations? I'm happy to say that the museum financed them solely by private contributions, and there are descendants of some of those early trustees who financed the excavations who are still connected with the museum today. And you can see from this statue why it became very easy to fund the excavations. This statue was one of the first things that arrived back. The excavations started in 1905. This statue of Tutankhamen and his wife came to the museum in 1906. And it was proclaimed by the curator as one of the finest pieces of art the Egyptians ever produced. And people were absolutely in love with it. And it is really a spectacular example. So they definitely decided to go ahead and fund the excavations and continue their funding. Now, and they were indeed rewarded. But as I said, it was not only the objects that were so important, but also the context. And by the time Reisner really got going, he had developed an eagle eye for not only for objects, but also for understanding the context of the objects and for recording. And his methods of recording are methods that we still use, in fact, today. What he would do every day when he got back to Harvard Camp, his excavation house, would be to write down his thoughts of what had happened every day, even trivial things, who came to tea. We have a complete social history or social picture of life at Giza in the early part of the 20th century. So not only the diary, but anything that was found was also recorded in what we call the object register, so that it was recorded by year, by month, and the sequential number. Every object was drawn, it was described, its context was listed, and any comments were included. And beyond that, the objects were photographed. This is one negative cabinet of more than a dozen that we have that house the 60,000 glass negatives that are part of the department. And that also explains why my office looks like this. But Reisner's methods were the most thorough certainly of his day, and still the basic system is still in use today. And more so than anybody else, I think you can understand why Reisner's been called the father of American archaeology and is universally respected. But it wasn't just Reisner, and we tend to forget that. He had a full staff. And many of these people, both American and Egyptian, remember the expedition went on for about 40 years. So young boys would start out as haulers of dirt, grow into being excavators, and then their sons would continue on. So by the time the expedition ended after World War II, many of these people had spent their entire lives excavating on behalf of Boston. And I have to say, it was a very teary-eyed Dowse Dunham who said goodbye to them for the last time. They were paid a bonus and left. And Dowse Dunham was one of the assistants for Reisner, who graduated from Harvard in 1913 and in 1914 was out in the field excavating. He went back to Egypt in the 1970s after not having been there for quite a long time. And as he was taken around by one of the guides at the site, he was saying, well, there was a man, the guide told Mr. Dunham, there was a man by the name of George Reisner, and he had an assistant by the name of Dowse Dunham who used to work here. And Mr. Dunham, who told that story to us, was just thrilled to be recognized as, or thrilled to have played such a major role in the lives of these men. There was an Egyptian Reis, or head, who Reisner treated like a son. But in any event, with this team and Reisner's uncanny sense of where to go and how to do it, he went first to what turned out to be one of the most productive areas, and that is right at the foot of here, right at the foot of the third pyramid. There, just a few inches below the floor, or actually, we're now on top of the pyramid, looking down to the pyramid temple, the temple that's right at the base of the pyramid. And it's right here, just literally a few inches below the floor, that he found this. Obviously a head, colossal in size, although you wouldn't realize it from here. Interestingly enough, the knees and legs were in another room of this structure. They had obviously been destroyed in antiquity. Probably some of the stone had been reused. And because it didn't look really too interesting, when it was brought up for what we call a division in front of the Antiquities Authority, the Egyptians awarded it to Boston, because what did they need with a big chunk of stone? Well, it came to Boston, and this is what it looked like. And that was okay, but then this says a lot about the history of museum installations. They got the idea that maybe it could be augmented a little bit. So this was the second installation, just a couple of years later. This is what it looks like today. And it is the largest statue of a king of the Old Kingdom ever excavated. And it was the expedition artist, together with an artist from the museum school, are the ones who did the restoration. And it is completely accurate, at least insofar as we know. And it is, of course, the focal point of the great Old Kingdom gallery today. And as you look across the upper rotunda, you see it from far across the museum. It really is a beacon. And I will say we truly have an embarrassment of riches, because we only have one focal point as you look across the upper rotunda, because we have many pieces that ought to be focal points that hopefully will one day in our newly renovated and expanded galleries. This sensational statue of the king and two goddesses is also unparalleled and spectacular. All of this from the pyramid, temples associated with the third pyramid, and this lovely head as well, also associated with the third pyramid. And for me, these are some of the most intriguing statues because they're unfinished. It's sort of a sculptor's how-to, an ancient Egyptian sculptor's how-to book in carving Egyptian statuary. You see from the very cubic nature of this one, slightly more refined and finely refined here. I will try to focus this, but I'm not optimistic. Well, never mind. Well, because of all these treasures, there was a problem. Namely, when somebody found something, it was the custom to reward them with a little money. That is, you really wanted to make sure you got what they found rather than the art market. So they essentially paid what would have been almost the going price. With all of these finds within the first few years, Reisner frankly ran out of money. And so fortunately, he took a 2-year hiatus and investigated the area of Nubia, or southern Egypt, which also explains why we have the finest Nubian collection in the world. It was at the time when the very first Aswan Dam was being raised, and they were going to flood out a large portion of about 100 miles of the Nile Valley, and Reisner excavated it and really named the cultures of Nubia and found 121 cemeteries and 8,000 graves, which are also another topic. But after those 2 years, the trustees succeeded in raising some more money, and Reisner continued. It was also a time when there was a war going on. That didn't stop Reisner. He worked right through it, although he did acknowledge that the seas would be unsafe at that time. So what he did was to wait until 1920 to send objects home. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these excavations, 1920, 100 tons of Egyptian art arrived on the doorstep of the museum. 1921, an additional 70 crates. And if you think about the history of the museum, it was right about that time that the trustees put a new wing onto the museum. And we think that probably had something to do with it. So after Reisner's Nubian work, he went back not to the pyramid because he had exhausted that, but to the mastabas or to the private tombs. Each one of these little rectangles is called a mastaba and represents a tomb. He went back to those, and some of them really did prove to be quite rewarding. And as unassuming as this mastaba looks, you're just looking at the front of it, it's right there that he found this, a bust that we know as Ankaf, the brother of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, the man who was in charge of building the second pyramid. Now, Ankaf, as you saw, was just found in the ground and probably found right where he had originally stood. Egyptian art is not portraiture. Egyptian art is idealizing. However, this image is a portrait, unquestionably. It's a unique individual, and it's a unique piece. And when you think about it, we shouldn't have this, because everything unique was supposed to go to Cairo. However, the Egyptians awarded Ankaf to us. And the reason they did is a story I'm going to go into in a minute. But I just want to point out that, as I mentioned, this statue is truly a portrait. And we know that because he would be somebody you would have met, dressed this way. He's certainly somebody you would meet on the street in the 40s. He looks extremely realistic. Now, I do have to tell you here, this is not Ankaf himself, but rather a plaster cast of Ankaf that is dressed. What happened is that during World War II, there was a lot of fear of German subs on the coast, and the museum made plaster casts of its most famous pieces, put the plaster casts on view, and sent the originals out to Williams College, where they remained during the war. So when they came back afterwards, they had a lot of plaster casts. They replaced the originals and had a lot of plaster casts. And one of them was was sitting in the department, and Dow's Dunham, then the curator, happened to walk in with a hat and just flipped his hat down on Ankaf. And he thought, gee, this looks pretty good. So the next day he brought in his suit. And that's how we come to have this. So this is by way of proving the point that he is very realistic. So how do we come to have Ankaf, truly one of our treasured pieces? Well, that goes back to the 21st of January, 1925. It was a time, actually, when Reisner was not in Egypt, but in Boston. Reisner worked for Boston was curator at the MFA and held a professorship at Harvard for 40 years. We have calculated that in that time, he made a total of 4 trips to Boston. Things have changed. But in any event, in 1925, Reisner was on one of his rare trips to Boston. And he left his staff in charge, telling them to clean around the East Cemetery, underneath the pyramid, thinking that there was really nothing to find. There were things to tidy up. Shortly after he left, right where my colleague Peter is pointing, is where the tripod of a camera was set up. And one of the legs of the tripod didn't sit quite properly, and it sunk down a little too far into the ground. And the photographer, an Egyptian by the name of Mohammed Ibrahim, had worked for Reisner for a long time and was extremely perceptive. So the spot was brushed, and this is what they found: a patch of plaster. The plaster was removed, and this appeared, namely a stone blocking. They removed the blocking, and there was a shaft and stairs. I think you can just see the stairs leading down here. They removed all the blocking, 100 feet of it, 100 feet of blocking, and it opened onto this. So, they continued down into here, the burial chamber, and this is what greeted them: a great glittering helter-skelter with gold everywhere, jewels, stone vessels, ceramics. It was, in fact, what looked to be an unplundered royal tomb. Reisner's assistant, a man named Alan Rowe, at that time took his field glasses, took his binoculars, and read some hieroglyphs that he was able to see here, and on one of these pieces. And those hieroglyphs said Snefru, the father of the builder of the Great Pyramid. And as Reisner later described, Mr. Rowe withdrew a single block of stone and looked in. It was then late in the afternoon and sunlight had gone. By the light of a candle, he saw only dimly a chamber, a sarcophagus, and the glitter of gold. Now, after he did this, Rowe, having read the cartouche of Snefru, told the world that he'd found the tomb of Snefru. The next thing he did was to telex George Reisner back home in Boston. Needless to say, Reisner was furious. Because and the first thing, again, Reisner did when he received this telegram informing him, at the same time that the world was informed that he had found the tomb of Snefru, Reisner's response was this: "Close tomb to await my arrival." And he instantly denied the report that it was the tomb of Snefru that had been found. And he made his way very slowly back to Giza. Got there, immediately took charge, and assessed the situation. And as he looked at this, he realized that he was looking at a pile of what was once furniture that had been made of wood and covered with gold leaf. And over the years, a fungus or white ants had eaten the wood, so all you had left was the gold foil. And he realized that the only hope to retrieve anything from this was a systematic removal of the object, of each layer of the fragments. There were, however, some logistical problems. First, the chamber was small. It was 6 feet high, 9 feet wide, and actually 17 feet long. And, of course, it was 100 feet underground. It was dark, it was hot, and it was full of flies. So what they had to do first was bring a light down. But the light, of course, brought heat. And so they were able to bring a fan down this 100 feet. The problem with the fan was that it blew the objects around. So they finally rigged up something on top and blew the air 100 feet down in a pipe to cool things. And as for the flies, they just hung a strip of fly paper. So they were able to, first by lying on mattresses on their bellies, they were able to first make a plan of the entire tomb as they saw it. And then they drew layer by layer. So this is just the top layer. And as you can see, every single object has a number, and that number corresponds to the plan. They drew and numbered everything, then they photographed it, they picked up the objects one by one, brought them into the excavation house, and photographed them again, and registered them in the object register. Then they went to the second layer. And that also explains why it took them 280 days to empty this tomb. They took 1,057 photographs and made 1,701 pages of notes on this tomb, all of which are still in the office. And then, in 1927, they were ready to open the sarcophagus. And remember, this was an unplundered royal tomb. This was a great event. And this was happening right around the time that Tutankhamen was found as well. So, they assembled in the burial chamber, 100 feet underground, the U.S. ambassador, the king's chamberlain, the director general of the Antiquities Service, the chief inspector of the area, Reisner, Dowse Dunham, his assistant, the Egyptian foreman, Joseph Lyndon Smith, the staff artist. And you can imagine their shock when they slowly opened the sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus proved to be empty. Stark empty. The artist was heard, Joseph Lyndon Smith, turned around and exclaimed, "George, she's a dud." Whereupon Reisner slowly turned to his distinguished guests and said, "Gentlemen, I regret the Queen is not receiving." So, we really don't know the true story of this tomb, the tomb of Queen Hetepheres, the wife of Snefru, the mother of the king who built the Great Pyramid. But all too late, Reisner concluded that on the basis of the fact that the objects were arranged in the tomb in opposite order to the way they would originally have been. That is, a sarcophagus goes into a tomb first. Here, it's last. So this suggested to Reisner that this was actually a reburial of this material, not the original burial, and he's probably right. But that was, excavating this material is not the only part of the story, because then came the restoration of the material. First they had to get the sarcophagus out of the tomb, all 100 feet up. And this is the sarcophagus of Hetepheres, mother of Khufu, coming out of the tomb. The sarcophagus is in Cairo today, and all of the original material, after 30 years of restoration, is in Cairo. However, what we are proud to show in the museum in a newly renovated gallery are exact copies of this material made by a cabinet maker and museum restorer by the name of Joseph Goethe, whose daughter is still alive today and remembers having this material in her house as she was growing up, as he spent more than several decades trying to put it back together. So that glittering helter-skelter mess that you saw proved to be the traveling bedroom suite of Hetepheres, mother of the king who built the Great Pyramid. So, this is the curtain box. Curtains went around this and would have given the Queen privacy. This is, of course, her bed. You saw her carrying chair a minute ago. Well, so why do we have all the replicas and why does Cairo have the originals? Well, by contract, all of the contents of an unplundered royal tomb went to Cairo. And Reisner didn't dispute that. The Egyptians loved Reisner. They hated Howard Carter because he always gave them an argument. Reisner they loved because Reisner was always friendly and deferential to them, but Reisner always got his way. That was the difference. Reisner said, here it is. All of this tomb material belongs to you. But in the next breath he said, but I need something to show the trustees. And that's why we have Ankaf. Because he was able to argue that with all of that work, he needed something to show. So, later on, in the 1930s, Reisner worked in a number of places, but his health began to deteriorate. He spent most of his time here in Giza in Harvard camp, and you can see the splendid surroundings he worked in. He worked as late as he could by the light of an oil lamp with his only real friends, his American staff and his Egyptian staff, and his 13 dogs. The Harvard camp was really a rambling mud, brick, and rubble house which overlooked the pyramids. And not only did it serve as a place where he lived, it also served as his workroom and his storeroom. He lived a very Spartan life. As I said, he worked right through World War I. He certainly was not going to let World War II stop him. And when Rommel advanced on Cairo, he was persuaded to move down into a tomb, which became also both a home and workroom. And he worked right through World War II as well. And his report to the director of the museum that year said that everything was just fine, and by living in the tomb, the air raid sirens did not, in fact, annoy him. Reisner's shown here with some of his dogs, and we figured that his chief entertainment, in addition to these dogs, was reading detective stories. And it was Reisner at that time was quite an institution. Every young archaeologist came to see him for tea. They nicknamed him Saint of the Desert. And despite his advancing age, he continued work. He went blind at the end, and we have some very tragic pieces of black construction paper where he would outline the mastaba structures or the tomb structures in white paint. But still he refused to leave. He died right here in Harvard camp at the age of 72, surrounded by his loyal Egyptian staff and some people from the museum. And he's buried right here in the Anglo-American cemetery outside of Cairo. Well, those were the war years in 1942. And nothing could be done with Harvard camp and all the material it contained, all the records and so forth, until 1947, when Dowse Dunham and William Stevenson Smith, another curator, went to Cairo for the purpose of figuring out what to do with the expedition. And regretfully, they decided to close it down. There was rising nationalism at the time, and they really had nobody like Reisner, nobody who could replace him. So they shipped back 60 boxes of notes and papers to the museum. They shipped back 1,300 detective stories to Harvard, where they are still available today. And so, although the doors of Harvard camp closed for the last time in 1947, our work goes on to still record and publish what Reisner found. And this is one of the reasons we do that. This is a picture Reisner took in the 1920s. This is the same tomb today, where you can see that only about a third of it is still preserved. So rather than excavate, we're involved, we try to keep up with the publication. And there are many problems, many things causing that, not the least of which is rising population and a higher water table that brings salt into the monuments. The salt crystallizes on the surface, it literally explodes and forces the decoration out. And we have other problems too. These are some of our glass negatives that are stored in our basement, and you can see this halo around them. And that halo is caused by the emulsion disintegrating and just vanishing. Fortunately, we have a project funded by the Mellon Foundation that's enabled us to scan all of the Giza negatives and record them digitally. And within the week, they'll go online on the World Wide Web so that any of our Giza material, not only the glass negatives, but all the diaries, all the object registers, and all the records will be available to anybody. We are indeed grateful to the Mellon Foundation for making this possible. So this really is the future of the excavations and the MFA, our continued efforts to publish both on the web and in hard copy. And we have many people doing that. I want to conclude by saying it's been a good first 100 years. But the future for the next 100 years also is bright. This is a now outdated version of the model of the expansion the MFA is hoping to do. We're hoping to break ground within the next year or so, and it's going to be great. It's going to be great for every department. What you see in pink will be the expanded quarters of the Egyptian department on the ground floor and the classical department on the second floor. So this will essentially be an ancient museum within the museum. We will double our space, and we will be able to put on view so many more of the excavated treasures than we have up until now. And I can't tell you how exciting it is to be part of that. And I think it's going to be a really exciting moment for the entire city. I also want to say that these last few years particularly have been very exciting. Not only have we been involved in the planning of these galleries, but we've also made some stellar acquisitions. This is another piece that defies the rules. This is another portrait sculpture, this one of not the Old Kingdom, but the Middle Kingdom, about 1900 BC. And it comes to us, it's made possible, well, let me first put it in perspective for you. What you see here also, obviously, is not an idealized representation. This is a sweet, idealized representation of about 2000 BC. This is what we had to represent the Middle Kingdom, a great gaping hole for us. We were thrilled on the occasion of our centennial to be able to add this queen to our collection, and you can see that she has a lot more character than the slide I previously showed you. She has signs of, she has a very round face, the suggestions of furrows around her nose and mouth, and really a lot of substance. And then the rest of the story right here in profile, and here, three-quarter view, our most recent acquisition. Our most recent acquisition is made possible by somebody in town that is intimately connected with you two, namely Stan Calderwood. I believe that your director is the Stanford Calderwood director of the Athenaeum. Stan Calderwood funded positions. He funded a curatorial position at Harvard. He funded a professorship at BU. He funded a professorship at Wellesley. And he founded a curatorship at the MFA. But he did more than that. I went to him at one point asking him for help in acquiring an object, and he looked at me and said, "Rita, would you like me to buy you that object, or would you like me to give you an endowment?" And, well, I'm not a financial person, but I knew what a good thing was. And, of course, I told him we would like to have an endowment. Well, 4 years before he died, Stan Calderwood signed off on the paperwork that allocated $4 million to the Egyptian department of the museum for the purchase of Egyptian art. But for any of you who knew Stan, and I'm sure a lot of you did, particularly if you're connected with the Athenaeum, Stan wasn't going to make it that easy. and he made it a challenge grant. So I'm very happy to say that at this point, the Department of Art of the Ancient World has been able to raise more than $1.5 million toward that $4 million. And as I look over the audience today, I see that many of you have contributed to our Calderwood challenge. Pick up a brochure because it's got great pictures in it. So including our most recent and what will become one of our most famous acquisitions. So we've stopped acquiring on the scale that we did in the 1920s. We no longer ship 100 tons at a time, except for special exhibitions. But stay tuned because we have some pretty exciting projects coming up. Thank you. And of course, I'm happy to take questions. We also do take people to Egypt, so I know that that's always a question. And a couple of people here have just come back with me. Yeah? In about a month. Actually, we're planning a trip with the museum in February of 2006. A trip that will be both a beginner's trip, actually two back-to-back trips, one a beginner's trip and the other a more advanced trip, which will include Libya.
A couple of questions with regard to the sites. That 100-foot deep tomb, is that through sand and rock?
Limestone.
It was initially done through limestone.
Oh, I'm sorry, I should repeat the question. The question was that 100-foot deep tomb, was it through sand or stone? And it was through limestone. The sand that you see on the surface doesn't go down very far, and it overlies a bed of limestone. And the limestone is in varying degrees of quality. So it would not have been a big deal. Limestone is also a soft stone, so it would have been easy enough for them to carve. And believe it or not, 100 feet is not unusual. That whole area is just honeycombed with tombs of that depth.
And were those cemeteries built simultaneously with the pyramids? Or?
The question was, were the cemeteries built simultaneously with the pyramids? That's a very good question, and it was actually a very good observation on your part, because as you looked down on that one aerial view, you saw that the tombs were laid out in nice, neat streets. And it truly is a necropolis, that is, a city of the dead, with emphasis on city. When the Great Pyramid was built, all of those tombs were laid out, maybe not built right away, but laid out specifically for his closest family members and top members of the bureaucracy. The Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, collapsed because the bureaucracy got too big. And that at first the king just had his family taking care of things for him, and he could trust them. And then it expanded, and each family member needed more people to serve him, and the cult of the king, the continued worship of the king, was supposed to continue long after his death. And each priest needed assistance, and each assistant needed more assistance, so it just got out of hand. And pretty soon the bureaucrats became more powerful than the king.
Would that 100-foot tomb have had a mastaba on top of it?
The question was whether the 100-foot tomb would have had a mastaba on top of it. That tomb is a real enigma for us. There was nothing found on top of it, and in fact it wouldn't have been found had the photographer's tripod not sunk down there. However, remember that it was a reburial. It wasn't an original burial. And that the likelihood is that the queen was buried someplace else first. And that tomb may well have had a mastaba, or even queens often had small pyramids right outside the Great Pyramid. So, yeah, we were just there a couple of weeks ago and can verify that it had nothing on top of it.
Yes, the pyramids were built to mathematical perfection. And I understand, I don't know how true it is, but you could even sharpen a razor inside the pyramid.
I can address some of that. The question was that your understanding was that the pyramids were built to mathematical perfection. And I absolutely verify that. They were oriented to the cardinal points, and they are just a couple of seconds off exactly the cardinal points. The second part of the question was sharpening razor blades within. Now, I will say that you cannot get a razor blade between the blocks. The fit is so tight, is so perfect. As far as sharpening blades, I'm not sure how that would work.
I don't know, I read that. Anyway,
Who built the pyramids? Also a good question. Years ago in Sunday school, I remember learning that Jewish slaves built the pyramids. I will tell you absolutely that is not true for any of you who also learned it in Sunday school. There were Semitic people in Egypt, but not until about 500 years later. So it's that part is an impossibility. Each town, remember the Nile flooded. Up until the Aswan High Dam was built, the Nile flooded. And when the fields were flooded, you really couldn't work on the farms. However, you could work elsewhere. And when the fields were flooded, the river came right up to the desert edge. And the desert edge is where the pyramids are located. And work on the pyramids was sort of like a corvée labor. You worked there for the time when there were the floods. You could cut the blocks and literally move them right up to the pyramids. So there were gangs of men who came from all over Egypt who worked on the pyramids. And there was probably a permanent staff that, the head architects and bureaucrats who worked there year-round, and probably also prisoners. But they were well fed, and we've recently found the living quarters of the people who built the pyramids. We found their granaries, we found their dormitories, we found their administrative centers, and we know that they were well fed with a high percentage of meat in their diet, because to haul all that stone, you really needed it. And let me just say one thing. Interestingly enough, there was a wall that divided the area of the pyramids, which was sacred to the kings, from the town of these workmen.
Could you give us the website for the digitalized glass negatives?
If you go to MFA.org, there are links to it. Look under Giza.
The pharaoh that is, just as you walk into the Egyptian room, the one that, where the head was separate from the torso that you put back together, the head was so much smaller than that body. Can you explain that?
The question was, why is the head of Menkaure, the colossal statue, so much smaller than the body? There have been several things suggested. That they made a mistake. Originally, he would have had a different headdress. They made the head smaller for that reason. The true answer is I don't know. But let me just say this. In his younger days, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the bodybuilder, posed next to Mycerinus, or Menkaure. And the picture of the bodybuilder Arnold Schwarzenegger has very large shoulders in comparison to the size of his head. And it's not out of the question that they measured the power of the king by his strength. And that was a very important thing. And also I will say that we tend to think every piece of Egyptian sculpture is perfect. But it's not. So it's also possible they got a little, by the time they got to the head, the proportions were a little off. So, but there, we're open to suggestion.
I wanted to ask, one of the pyramids has a cap on it.
Right.
What that was made of, was originally, that substance originally covered the entire pyramid, or something taken away?
The question was, the second pyramid, the middle pyramid, has what appears to be a cap on it. Originally, all of the pyramids were covered by a very fine-grained white limestone. That fine-grained white limestone can be found today in the mosques and houses of Cairo. So the upper layer, or the fine layer of stone, was removed, used either in the lime kilns or for building. And that top part is all that remains. But I will also say that the very most top, we now know, was covered with gold, so that the very tip of the pyramid would have had a gold cap. That, of course, is also gone.
Are there more than 2 of these naturalistic portraits? Is there any guesses as to why these came out into production?
The question was whether there are more than 2 of these naturalistic portraits and why they were made. Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I have to tell you there are more than 2. There are a handful, and the MFA has more than any other museum. I will tell you about, there's one piece that's the size of my fist that is an absolute portrait of a man who lived at about the time of Alexander the Great. And it's made, it's made out of a hard stone. He has a wart on the left side of his cheek, and crow's feet is just an amazing representation. We have also a head that depicts a man who's had a stroke. Very, very unusual, because the Egyptians, you can't tell age of a statue from looking at it, because they built for a timeless eternity, not for a moment in time. Why did they do portraiture? I think that there were anomalies. For every rule we have, there's something that breaks the rule. I think there are different reasons, and I think maybe I should talk to you about that afterwards, because it's a very interesting question and complex. Also, a number of portraits come at the time when there was Greek influence in Egypt. But Ankaf is 2,000 years before there was Greek influence.
Is there an irony to the fact that France does not have as much Egyptian artifacts as, say, Germany, given Napoleon's interest, the description of Egypt, the great monumental collection, those 7 volumes?
France does okay. Remember, France would have a better collection had Napoleon not been forced to hand over all the baggage of the French army to the English. However, the French continue to be very active in Egypt, and the Louvre, as well as many provincial museums in France, have stellar collections. Germany Germany had many early expeditions to Egypt, and they too had no shame in taking everything that was movable.
You mentioned the division of objects. Is the museum under any pressure now to return things to Egypt?
The question is whether the museum is under any pressure now to return things to Egypt. We have never been asked to return anything. And while I've had various Egyptian museum directors stand in front of pieces like Ankaf and sigh, they know that they were awarded to us legally by the terms of the day. And I think it is important to remember the context of all this, that is the growing population, the building activity that would have destroyed most of these things, or the robbers who would have plundered them and sold them on the market had they not been excavated. The Cairo Museum is unquestionably the finest Egyptian collection in the world. It's an embarrassment of riches. And that museum, there's nothing like it. Its equivalent does not exist in Iraq, in Persia, in anywhere in Mesopotamia, in Syria. And it's because of those very liberal and foresighted laws of the Egyptian Antiquities Department, which was founded in the 1850s, that that museum is there today.
What about current excavation, and is the MFA involved in anything at the moment?
The question is, what about current excavation, and is the MFA involved in anything at the moment? There are, I would say, at any given year, there are 100 excavations going on in Egypt from countries that you wouldn't begin to imagine. From Eastern Europe to, maybe even some other countries in Africa. The Egyptians also grant permission to excavate to any reputable institution today, as they did in the early part of the century. We are still involved in Giza. We have been in the last decade. We have gone back to a number of other places as well, not to continue excavation again, but to check on what Reisner did and complete the documentation. And right now, we're involved in an excavation of our storerooms. And for the first time, thanks to an NEH grant of 7 years duration, we are finally able to properly archivally rehouse and record on a database all that we excavated. But it goes beyond that. I mentioned that Reisner took a 2-year hiatus from 1907 to 1909 from excavating in Egypt to excavate in the Sudan because the Aswan Dam was being raised. The original dam was built in 1898. And you all remember the Nubia campaign of the 1960s when Abu Simbel was raised. There's another dam being built in the Sudan, and that's at the Fourth Cataract, and that will flood out an additional 100 miles of unexplored territory in the Nile Valley. And while we're not directly excavating, because we don't have the staff that we once had, and it's much more complicated to get people over there now, but we are working out the details to fund an expedition, a salvage operation that's actually run by a Polish mission to the Sudan that's been there for the last 30 years. So we will continue to benefit via division from excavation. We'll continue to support the culture and the elucidation of the cultures of Egypt and Sudan as we have done. So the answer is sort of a yes and a no, but we are definitely involved in scholarship in both Egypt and Sudan.
What is the significance of the object which is held tightly in the fist of the
Okay. What is the significance of that thing that's held by statues? This is an abbreviated, the Egyptians were keenly aware of what sculpture could do and what it couldn't do. And in stone, they would never carve out anything thin and elongated. So those are abbreviations for walking sticks or scepters of office. And I see Monica is coming up here. I think there's a reception outside. I'll be happy to take more questions outside, but I did want to thank you for being such a wonderful audience. It's great to see a full house.